There's a beautiful moment in the Jacob and Esau story when, after decades of estrangement, after betrayals of trust involving blessing fraud and porridge theft, the two brothers reunite. Now, it's not easy. There's ample tension simmering beneath the surface. The two brothers are hardly running toward each other with open arms. Esav is accompanied by 400 men. Yaakov divides his camp in two, hoping at least half of his clan will survive the onslaught. Yaakov spends the night having visions of conflict, or perhaps a sort of fever dream in which he vanquishes his brother's spectral projection. Suffice it to say, rapprochement is hardly a foregone conclusion. And then something happens. The two meet and they embrace. The text tells us that despite Yaakov's real concerns about grudges held, about the lasting results of parental favoritism, Vayarotz Esav likrato v'yichabkehu, Esau ran toward him and embraced him. Vayipol out sevarav, and he fell on his neck. V'yishakehu v'yivku, and he kissed Jacob and they wept. There's every reason to take this story at face value. The two brothers are not best friends. At the end of the story, they will not make a life together, but they are brothers, and the brotherly love, lamrot hakol, despite it all, is palpable. And that's why a common rabbinic interpretation of this encounter has always troubled me. Because the Midrash notices something passed down in the Masoretic text. There are dots over each letter of Yishakehu, the word that describes Esav's kiss. Dots that to our sages indicate that there's more to the story. So Rashi says, some explain the dots as meaning that he did not kiss him with a whole heart. Whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, is it not well known that Esau hated Jacob, but at that moment his pity was really aroused, and he kissed him with his whole heart? So perhaps the kiss was genuine. Perhaps it wasn't. But the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah goes further, casting the entire story in doubt and rendering Esav not as a lovable, if impulsive jock, but an irredeemable villain. The Midrash teaches that Esau came not to kiss Jacob, but to bite him. But our ancestor Jacob's neck became like marble, and that wicked man's teeth were blunted. Hence, Vayivku, and they wept, teaches that Jacob wept because of his neck, and Esau wept because of his teeth. Where on earth does such a cynical reading come from? Reading this, we have to think that perhaps there's more to the story, that Esav is more than simply a character in Torah, but an archetype, a polemical projection of some later time in which descendants have made the life of Bnei Yaakov, that is, the Jewish people, quite terrible. Indeed, both the Hebrew Bible and the later rabbinic tradition align Esav both with his Edomite descendants and with the Roman Empire, and later with the Christian authorities who kept our ancestors under their thumb. You may recall that the Haftarah for Parashat Vayishlach, where the story comes from, is from Obadiah, who's pretty hard on Esav, to say the least. How thoroughly rifled is Esau, how ransacked his hordes. Your warriors shall lose heart, O Teman, and not a man on Esau's mount shall survive the slaughter. For the violence that you did to your brother Jacob, disgrace shall engulf you, and you shall perish forever. But none of these traditions really answer the question of just what Esav and the Edomites did that was worthy of this kind of Jewish animus. What violence? Which is why we might consider a new theory put forward by biblical scholar Richard Elliot Friedman. Friedman, of course, was our own scholar in his own residence back in April. And Friedman asks a question which is particularly relevant to this Shabbat, the first, as I said, of these Tzlata de Poranuta in Aramaic, the 3 Shabbatot of admonition. Now, before I share the particulars of Friedman's hypothesis, a reminder about this time of year. How does all of this come together? There are 3 special haftarot on 3 Shabbatot leading up to Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, we commemorate Chorban Habayit, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. According to Jeremiah 52, that's the very last chapter of Yirmiyahu, Nebuchadnezzar moves against Jerusalem on Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. After some time, he captures the sons of King Zedekiah, Tzidkiyahu, slaughters those sons in front of him, blinds him, and imprisons him in Babylonia until his dying day. And then Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple on the 9th and the 10th of Av. The Babylonians are clearly the villain of the story. But what if that's not exactly how it happened? What if it were not the Babylonians who destroyed the temple, but the Edomites? In other words, what if there was a better reason to distrust or even to hate Esau, the progenitor of a nation who is responsible for destroying our most sacred shrine? Could we then better understand the Midrashic tradition that paints him with such a villainous brush? Today's Haftarah that you heard chant so beautifully by Jim Jacobs is from the beginning of Jeremiah, and it includes the powerful metaphor of Sir Nafuach, a steaming pot tipped away from the north. And as I said, the prophet is explicit eventually that Babylon, north and east across the Fertile Crescent, is to blame for the destruction of Judah and of the temple. But, asks Friedman, what then about this other passage from Jeremiah 41? In the 7th month, Ishmael ben Netaniah ben Elishama, who was of royal descent and one of the king's commanders, came with 10 men to Gedaliah ben Achikam at Mitzpah, and they ate together there at Mitzpah. Then Ishmael ben Netaniah and the 10 men who were with him arose and struck down Gedaliah ben Achikam ben Shaphan with a sword and killed him, because the king of Babylon had put him, that is Gedaliah, in charge of the land. So we have an incident in which the Babylonian vassal governor is assassinated by his own people. This in and of itself may not be surprising, because one can imagine that such an authority figure would have been widely disliked, even among his people. The problem is what happens next in the story, which doesn't quite line up. 80 men came from Shechem, from Shiloh, and from Samaria, their beards shaved, their garments torn, and their bodies gashed, carrying meal offerings and frankincense to present at the house of the Lord. These 80 men go to the temple in Jerusalem. They're ambushed, murdered by Ishmael ben Netaniah and his men, and their bodies are dumped into a cistern. Now, these events are the reason that we have a third minor fast in the cycle. The first, of course, is Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, which marks the beginning of the Babylonian siege. The second is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the day on which, according to the Babylonian Talmudic tradition, the walls were breached in the siege on the second temple by the Romans, but the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, says the walls of Jerusalem were breached on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz in the Babylonian raid on Jerusalem. And the third date is Tzom Gedaliah, the day on which the last vestige of Jewish sovereignty is snuffed out. Which begs the question, if Gedaliah ben Achikam is assassinated on the day after Rosh Hashanah, more than 2 months from now, and the temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av less than 3 weeks from today, how is the temple still standing for those 80 men from regions north of Jerusalem to come and offer sacrifices? Could it be that Jerusalem was destroyed, but that the temple gets destroyed on some later date? And then a biblical editor conflated the two events. Further supporting this argument, if we rewind Jeremiah just a bit further, to the account in chapter 39, instead of the version that I mentioned before, we get this. The Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians, burned down the king's palace and the houses of the people by fire, and they tore down the walls of Jerusalem. What's missing? The temple. There's no mention here of the temple. Now, why does Friedman think, if not the Babylonians, that it was the Edomites who destroyed the temple? Some of it relates to my own question. Why is our tradition so vitriolic against Edom? Why is that so disproportionate to Esav's character and his behavior in Genesis? But also, Friedman notices that Psalm 137, which begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat, there we wept, as we thought of Zion," includes in the psalm Edom as part of the Chorban's villainy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. If indeed they, the Edomites, played some role, what might that role have been? The potential kicker, though, is in the apocryphal text of Esdras, where we have the most explicit assignment of Edomite blame. In it, the Israelite exilic leader, Zerubbabel, pleads to the Persian king Darius, "You also vowed to build the temple, which the Edomites burned when Judea was laid waste by the Chaldeans, by the Babylonians." Now, this is surely not conclusive. Even Friedman admits there are other possible solutions to the problems identified here, but the idea that the Edomites, who occupied lands east of Eretz Israel and who were known to be aligned with the Babylonians, could have taken advantage of Jewish national weakness by destroying our central place of worship is not so far-fetched. What's interesting to me about Friedman's approach is not simply that it explains some textual variants, but that it makes more understandable the caricature our sages fashion in place of the more three-dimensional Esav. If Esav is about more than Esav, but also about Edom, and if Edom isn't just another enemy of the Jewish people, but the one that laid waste to our holy temple, we might better be able to understand certain resentments bubbling beneath the surface of our written and our oral traditions. Meanwhile, as we move toward yet another Tisha B'Av, we might consider how our continued engagement with Torah as an Eitz Chaim, as a tree of life, ever growing, ever revealing its secrets to us, makes moments of renewal and restoration that come later in our calendar even more fulfilling. Torah should surprise us. Sometimes it does this through learning ancient traditional commentaries. Sometimes the surprises come through modern scholarship. As Ben Bagbag reminds us in Perkei Avot, "Hafoch ba v'hafoch ba decholava." We should turn it over and over again because all is contained within it. And it's that vision of Judaism as an ever-growing tree, or as a constantly revolving scroll that unites this Shabbat, these 3 Shabbatot of admonition, with the 7 Shabbatot of consolation that follow, with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, and finally with Simchas Torah, where we'll renew the whole enterprise of Torah learning and Jewish living once again. Shabbat Shalom.